Hello, welcome to the Raw podcast brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. My name is Jason Jones. I'm joined by James Copley and Phil Smith. Lads, pleasure as always on a Monday morning. And those Monday mornings are made quite a lot easier when you see Sunderland play like that on a Sunday afternoon. What a performance from the lads. A 4-0 win over Sheffield Wednesday, their first home game of the season. It's now 6 points from 6 in the Championship, still to concede a goal. I mean, we're sort of at the risk of running away with ourselves a little bit here, James, but how impressive was that performance yesterday?
Yeah, really impressive. I was most surprised. I think when Alan Brown's name wasn't on the team sheet, I was a little bit concerned just because he brought so much stability and calmness and experience to the Cardiff game. And that's not necessarily a criticism of Chris Rigg, who obviously we all have a lot of confidence in, but you did just wonder whether that would be to Sunderland's detriment. And it actually turned out to be the other way around. Chris Rigg playing in that sort of second striker role in the number 10 position, Joe moving a little bit further back, really helped Sunderland. And I think me and Phil discussed on the whistle video on YouTube after the game that young, energetic midfield of Neil, Job, and Rigg really did a number on Sheffield Wednesdays. I think Roll probably got his tactics a little wrong in the first half as well. But yeah, Barry Bannon didn't really get a look in for that first 25 minutes, in which Sunderland went 3-0 up. And just so many positives to take from the game. Obviously, Mayenda netting a couple as well. And in terms of Regis Labrie, you couldn't ask really for a better two opening league games. He's won away, he's kept 2 clean sheets, and he's won at home. Scored 6 goals. There's a striker scoring. It's dreamland, really. I don't think anybody expected Sunderland to be this good this early on. There is mitigation in a sense that I think Cardiff had injuries and they look pretty poor. Sheffield Wednesday, we're not really sure really how good they are yet. So I think coming into Burnley on Saturday, obviously we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I think that's a huge test given how they've started the season. But hugely encouraged so far. And I think, what's been the most pleasing aspect is that we can all see what Labrie is trying to implement and that the players have bought into it, which is massive, really. So yeah, it was a lot better than the last time we played Sheffield Wednesday at home at the Stadium of Light.
I mean, that's one thing that you sort of touched upon last weekend, Phil, that this idea that we expected Labrie to come in and implement a certain style of play. Maybe didn't quite execute that against Cardiff, but it certainly felt as if Sunderland looked a lot more like the sort of Sunderland that we're expecting to see under him going forward on Sunday.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that was probably the biggest positive, really. I think that at the start of the season, obviously results are so important, especially when you've got a new head coach, because I think it can have such a big impact on the general mood, can't it? And if you play well but you're losing, then it can start to get away from you. But I think you want to see early on in the season that the performances are there that you think are going to deliver over a 46 game season. And I think that was why after the Cardiff game we were kind of positive, because you can't really criticise a team when they go away from home and keep a clean sheet and win the game. But we didn't really. There wasn't a huge difference from the Sunderland that we saw towards the end of last season. They were just more effective. Whereas I thought yesterday it was. For me, it was the best performance since Tony Mowbray's departure. I know, there was the win over Leeds at the Stadium of Light, and there were occasional moments where Sunderland produced a really good result. But I think in terms of actually dominating the opposition by winning the game, by being completely on the front foot, spells of the game where it was the pressing that just completely undid Sheffield Wednesday. Spells where they knew to put their foot on the ball and slow it down and actually just control it that way. It wasn't as if they just played the same way for 90 minutes. I think it was really, really exciting. It's the first time, I think, in a long time that it's been a performance and a result. And it was the best football we've seen since Mowbray left for me by a country distance. So, really, really exciting, a really positive day. Obviously, the caveat being every other team now is going to watch that and go, yeah, let's not do that. So I don't think there's too many teams that are going to play out from the back and be as sort of aggressive as Sheffield Wednesday, where maybe there was a little bit of hubris from their opening day win and how they set it up. So something they're going to have to find different solutions in the weeks ahead, because there's not going to be many games like that. But what a really, really cathartic day, actually, because it's been miserable, hasn't it, at the Stadium like all year. And I think everyone, it was just so nice to have a day that people could just really enjoy and a performance to get behind.
I mean, front to back, there were fantastic performances all over the pitch. We sort of touched on the midfield already, so we might as well start there. That midfield three, Dan Neil, Joe Bellingham, Chris Rigg, obviously coming in the side. Average age of just 19, which almost boggles the mind, really, when you see how well they performed yesterday. I mean, how impressed were you with that trio yesterday, James?
Hugely impressed. As I mentioned, was slightly worried when Alan Brown dropped out, but it's mad. It's mind-boggling, really, that Dan Neil is the senior figure in that midfield at 22 years old. Yes, he's got a lot of experience, but he's just come on so much this season. You could see it during pre-season. He's taken it to another level. His discipline, his awareness, his passing ability. He's a real top player. And I know we're all raving about Chris Rigg, and rightly so. At 17, he's definitely a player. But Dan Neil's superb. Then you look at Joe Bellingham. Again, the summer seems to have done him the world of good. He looked a bit tired at times and jaded last season, but he's got so much quality. I quite like him. We were saying, Jason, weren't we, during the game, that we quite like him a little bit further back. Obviously, he can play as the 10, but when he was playing alongside Dan Neil, he gives such athleticism, got pace, power, and he actually carries the ball as well up the field, which is good to see. And he's such an impressive physical specimen that he glides over the pitch. And obviously Chris Rigg, I mean, what more can we say about him? His mentality after, playing a lot of pre-season, but then falling behind Alan Brown in the pecking order. Then he finds himself starting against Preston. He doesn't sulk. He's still probably the best player on the pitch despite Sunderland losing. Then he finds himself back in the team, in the league, and he has the mentality to come on against Cardiff on the right hand side of Sunderland's attack, and then he's back playing as a number 10 for the first time in a while against Sheffield Wednesday. So it's so good to see, and strange in a way, really, because obviously Pierre Ekwa's on the bench and he's not getting on at the moment or getting a game. And it's easy to see why, because that midfield trio is such quality. I think good news about Alan Brown as well, it only being a minor knock, and hopefully he'll come back in. But yeah, it was delightful, really, that midfield as a three. It was very well balanced and nice to have that little bit of competition. Obviously, I mentioned Ekwa and Brown, but they could come in at some point. Obviously, all eyes on the transfer market, but yeah, it was honestly, it was a joy to watch at times. I think, again, you do have to caveat that with maybe Sheffield Wednesday tactically didn't set up right for it, and that allowed Sunderland the space. But there's so much talent there that if they continue to grow, get that cohesion, it's hugely exciting to be a Sunderland fan.
And I guess the big question now, Phil, is does Alan Brown get back in this team? I mean, Chris Riggs, he's given a pretty good account of himself, hasn't he? It's going to be hard for the new signing to just waltz back into Reggie's side.
Yeah. My instinct is, to be honest, if he's fit, is that he probably does, just because I think Burnley it's such a different game, isn't it? And I think that's kind of, I asked Labrice after the game, exactly that. Can you keep Rigg out of this side? And he didn't really answer the question other than to say, that midfield three had been brilliant in this game. But every game's different. And I think the important thing is to have different solutions, really, isn't it? And I think that Burnley, and that when you look at what they've done in the first two games of the season, it's a little bit frightening, really. And I think we all wondered whether, was Scott Parker the right choice? Is Vincent Kompany leave, and how big an impact is that going to have on them? And the answer seems to be very little, because they've got that quality. So my instinct is that might be a good game for Alan Brown. I think maybe his experience, maybe that defensive nous especially, is something that you'll actually need. But in some ways, it doesn't really matter too much, because the point with Rigg is he's either going to start or he's the first sub that comes off. He's now in that position. He's going to be the game changer if he doesn't start the game. And we also know with him, he can come off the right if that's where the game's going. He can play as a 10. He can play in centre midfield. So my gut tells me that for Burnley, possibly Brown does come straight back in. But in some ways, I'm not sure how much it really matters. Rigg is going to feature in the game. He is now, if he's not in the starting lineup, he is Sunderland's number one game changer. And I think it's an absolute credit to him that he's been able to do that. I mean, that little touch and pass for Mayenda's second goal to set Clarke away. Players, with hundreds of games under their belt can't do that. That's just God-given talent, really. And it's just really exciting to see where he's going to go from here. And yeah, it's nice to have that competition. As James said, we haven't even really spoken about Ekwa yet. And, he's got a real battle to get his way back in. Obviously, mainly because his match fitness is behind the others, because he had his injury in pre-season. But you've got four central midfielders there who at times have all looked top-end championship level. So it's emerging as a position of real strength for Sunderland, and it's going to be exciting to see the four of them kind of battle it out, really.
The man who opened the scoring yesterday, Dennis Cirkin, obviously got an assist in the opening game as well against Cardiff. I mean, how good is it to see him back and fit and firing, and how much of a difference does he make to this Sunderland team, James?
He makes a big difference. He's a real quality player, and Nick Barnes from the BBC put the question to him after the game, have you done anything differently in pre-season? You appear to have bulked up physically, and he seems to have strengthened a little bit as well. His physical shape has changed, and he just sort of brushed it off and smiled with a sort of a little knowing nod. But I think that's testament really to how hard he's worked to get back. I think he really does sort of live and breathe football. I think Sunderland does mean a great deal to him. He's been so unlucky with injuries as well. And last season, I think he only played 8 times in the Championship, which is a massive loss. I mean, this is a player that when we signed him, there were rumours that he would go back to Tottenham because they had a buyback clause, which has since expired. That's how good a form he was in under Tony Mowbray at Sunderland at one point. Obviously, there was those 2 goals towards the back end of that playoff season at Preston. Was it Preston or West Brom? Preston, wasn't it? West Brom, yeah. He scored at Cardiff as well. So he's really got a lot of quality, a lot of talent. It was such a shame he was out for so long. But that, the Sunderland's flanks at the moment with Cirkin and Clarke on the left and Hume and Roberts on the right, it adds real balance. 2 top quality fullbacks with 2 top quality wingers. It makes a great deal of difference. And what I like about both Cirkin and Hume is they're both really combative. They get stuck in. They're both good going forward. And they're both so defensively sound. He's a huge asset, and I really hope he can stay fit for the full season, because I honestly think, to be honest, if he does stay fit for a long period of time, he's in that sort of, although he's a little bit older, sort of Joe bracket of potentially going quite high, up into the Premier League. I think clubs would certainly be looking at him. There's a couple in Sunderland's squad like that, to be fair, but I think the main thing is that he's back fit and firing, and a huge asset to Sunderland. He's a great player.
And a word on Luke O'Nien as well, Phil. It's now 2-2 for him. Joint top scorer in the Championship, isn't it? I don't think any of us would have predicted that 2 weeks into the season. I mean, how good has he been? And I guess the other question is as well, given how well him and Adji Elise are playing together, who is the starting centre-back partnership for Sunderland once Dan Ballard is fit?
Yeah, I think O'Nien's probably. I was kind of amazed that people were still talking about O'Nien's position at centre-half coming into the season, really. I just think that last season he was excellent. Sunderland's defensive record was pretty good. He's clearly the best option in possession out of any of Sunderland's options, really. And I think those the first 2 games of the season, if that debate had come back round, it's kind of over now, isn't it? Because I just don't think anyone can realistically pick a team without O'Nien in it. And I think, he does make the odd mistake within games, but it's the Championship. If he didn't make any mistakes ever, and he scored goals and he just consistently was raking 50-yard passes, then he'd be playing for Man City. So I think you've got to bear this in mind when you judge his performances. I don't think there's any way O'Nien comes out of this team other than through injury and suspension, to be honest. And the Elise one's really interesting because I think realistically Ballard's going to play when he's fit. I think that's just the way it's going to go because Ballard is at such a high level. But I think Elise has been really, really, really good. And he was probably one of the under-the-radar performers yesterday, actually. And I like how simple he keeps things. And I mean that as a compliment, not a criticism. He doesn't mess about. He just does his job with little fuss. I thought he was really good yesterday. And that's going to be a really interesting dynamic because although I suspect Ballard will come back in, the nice thing for Sunderland is they really don't have to rush him. They don't have to be taking any risks with him. There's 2 games now before the international break. I doubt he's going to be available for Burnley. Possibly he could be involved against Portsmouth, but Sunderland don't have to rush him. So they can really give him that international break to get fully up to speed. Because don't forget with Ballard, he only played 45 minutes, didn't he? So he's actually not really had any match fitness whatsoever. So it's going to be really valuable for Sunderland to be able to actually give him a bit more time to get fully up to speed. And then, Elise is the player in possession at the moment. The nice thing is that at the moment, the fullbacks are a position of real strength, but we know that the depth is a huge concern. If either Hume or Cirkin was to get injured right now, it would be a big problem. Ballard being fit means you've got Elise as an option at left back as well. And with both his and Cirkin's injury record, that's really valuable. But I'm sort of pleased you asked that, because for me, Elise was one of the under the radar performers yesterday. I thought he was really, really, really strong, and sort of that was the foundation really for all the attacking stuff that Sunderland were able to do.
Man who certainly wasn't under the radar, James, Elise Mayenda, finally opened his Sunderland account. 2 goals for the 19-year-old. Really lovely to see as well. The reception he got coming off in the second half, standing ovation. Obviously, it helped that he was coming off at the same time as Chris Rigg, who I think the whole crowd was rabid for by the time he came off the pitch. But really impressive performance from Mayenda yesterday, and not just the goals, but the work rate as well.
No, absolutely superb. To bounce back from that Cardiff miss, which a lot of people have pointed out was probably a harder chance than it looked on telly. But one, you would be hoping that he was going to score, and I think he was hoping he was going to score as well. To bounce back from that, I think the faith from Lebris to give him the nod, it made me think back to Mick Beale's time at Sunderland, actually, where it was sort of he couldn't really decide which striker he wanted, could he? Kept dropping one from game to game and experimenting, but it looks like Mayenda's shirt to lose at the moment, and I think that vote of confidence has helped him massively. The finish for the first goal off his left foot, it's not easy, that, there's 2 defenders coming in, the goalkeeper's perhaps a little bit of no man's land, but to lift it over him, left foot curled into the corner in front of 40,000 fans as a 19-year-old, an under pressure 19-year-old who's missed his last big chance, who hasn't scored for the club despite being there over a year. It's massive. That goal is huge, and so well taken. Lovely to see him get his flowers from the Roker end as well. Chris Rigg sort of making sure that he got that adulation. Fantastic. Everybody was so pleased for him in Sunderland's squad. Stuff like that you really like to see. And then the second goal, the touchdown and the pass from Chris Rigg is ludicrous, really, to split the fullback and the centre back. Clarke does what Clarke does, fantastic down the wing. But for Eliza Mayenda to have the wherewithal, the presence of mind to be attacking that back post, it's an easy finish in the end because he does the hard work initially. And as Phil mentioned on the whistle video we did, we haven't really seen that for a long time at Sunderland. A striker arriving in those positions, and it was a big frustration of mine last season. The amount of times Patrick Roberts got to the byline and sort of cut one across, and there was nobody really there. So to see a striker do that in Sunderland colours was fantastic. And maybe we've all been perhaps a little guilty of forgetting just how young Mayenda is, and has been during his early Sunderland career so far. And all of a sudden, perception's everything. He scored 2 at the Stadium of Light in a league game, and now everybody believes he's a real good prospect again. And he is, and I think he probably always was. But goals are really hard to score, especially in a first-team environment when you haven't scored one before for your current club. So hopefully that's now a massive monkey off the back, and he can go in and start chipping in. I do think though that although he has scored, and that's a huge positive, that I think Sunderland still need to address that striker situation. I think what's a really interesting point is whether they get a senior striker in the door now, whether they just go for one and that leaves Mayenda as sort of the understudy. You'd probably be confident in him doing that role now he's netted a couple. Then whether they bring somebody in on loan who could potentially block Mayenda's pathway a little bit. So you would expect it's probably down to just the one now, but hugely impressive and pleasing performance, and just really nice to see a striker score at Sunderland.
It was almost a little bit surreal, wasn't it? Especially when that second one went in. It felt like I was sort of pinching myself. Sunderland striker actually scored 2 goals in a game. Feels a bit weird. But I guess that's the thing, isn't it, Phil? Like, even if Mayenda's not going to be starting every week, and obviously the hope remains that Sunderland will sign an experienced centre forward, and I'm sure we will talk about that in due course. The hope will be that he can at least be an effective contributor, whether it's as an impact substitute or potentially as a rotation option.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, to be fair, like, obviously the goals, it's obviously been a big talking point and stuff, but I think anybody who followed Sunderland through pre-season, and even the Cardiff game to a large extent, would say that he had taken a huge step forward. Like, I think that was, and yes, we were all saying Sunderland needed to sign an experienced striker, but I don't think anyone was talking as if Mayenda couldn't have a role to play. I think it was obvious pretty much from day one of pre-season that he'd taken a big step forward, and that something was really clicking with Lebris in terms of the conversations they were having in his role in the team. I think the other aspect of it as well is it's also about his teammates understanding his game as well, right? So we've now had 2 league games this season, one game at Cardiff when there was a lot of long balls played into him up against Callum Chambers and Gutas, and it's like, yeah, that's not his game. You know, he's not going to compete at this stage of his career like physical battles with centre half. That's not his game. But what you can actually see yesterday is that he's quick. He makes decent runs. He's got a decent touch. He can link up well. So I think it's like a bit of a process for both, really. It's about Mayenda making the improvements that he needs to moving forward. But it's also about his teammates understanding them as well. And I think you're beginning to see that. They understand how to use him. There's sort of developing that understanding. So I'm really enthusiastic about Mayenda. I don't think anyone was arguing before the game or would argue after that he's the answer and he's going to play 46 games. I mean, Chris Riggs not going to play 46 games. You know, at the age these guys are at, we've seen it. They're just not going to do it. So they need experienced, established support. But for me, there's no doubt that Mayenda's got a role to play. And, you know, we should be enthusiastic about a 19-year-old who's shown striker, that's shown all the attributes that he's shown. Probably the more interesting one, really, is when the other striker comes in, is where it leaves Rusin. Because Lebris has made fairly clear that he sees him at the moment as an impact substitute and that Mayenda's ahead of him in terms of start. So if, you know, you mentioned there about what impact does it have on Mayenda, I'm not sure it'll have too much an impact on Mayenda. For me, it's like Rusin's the interesting one. If he then becomes third choice striker, you know, he's 25 now. He's been at the club for a year. How does he see that situation developing? So that's kind of the interesting one for me. I think we've seen such huge strides from Mayenda in such a short space of time that I'm not even thinking about, you know, his role in the squad moving forward. So yeah, for me, the dynamic could be an interesting one. If, for example, Alexandre Mendy is the one who comes in, I feel like that's going to be really interesting to see what impact that has on Rusin.
I suppose that's part of the issue Rusin's facing as well, isn't it? He's already feeding on sort of drips and drabs. He's not getting the minutes, and we've seen the sort of the help that gives a player. You know, Mayenda didn't score against Cardiff, but the faith was shown in him. He got another 70 odd minutes or whatever it was against Wednesday, and he's repaid that faith with 2 goals. You know, Rusin isn't being afforded that luxury. I know he started against Preston in the cup, but it wasn't exactly the game to go out and establish yourself in a sense. I mean, like Phil says, it's only going to get harder for him from here on out if Sunderland bring in another striker, isn't it, James?
Yeah, I do feel for him because, again, said in the podcast before, I'm not really sure he's an out-and-out number 9, especially not one that can play by himself up there. I think he's more of a wide forward or a left winger. And again, it's going to be very difficult for him to get in that position as well as it stands. I mean, you know, say if Clarke was to go tomorrow, you would expect maybe Sunderland to strengthen that position. There's also Romain Mundle who could play there. You'd expect Rusin to be behind him even in that spot. So yeah, Phil's right to point out that one because it's a shame because he has shown flashes of quality during his Sunderland career, but it never really seems to have caught fire. Obviously, he had some issues when he came over from Ukraine in terms of his family settling and stuff, and that did set him back a little bit. He has had injury issues as well at times. He's then gone from Tony Mowbray to Mike Dodds to Mick Beale to Mike Dodds, now to Regis Slippery. So it's been a bit of a whirlwind for him, I would suspect, in a new country. And it does take time for players to settle. He has now had a year, so you would expect to be seeing something a little bit more. But yeah, as you mentioned, Jason, it's tough starting against Preston, coming in from the cold with an unfamiliar team. Really hard to judge, but you are struggling to see where he gets in. If Sunderland do sign that experienced striker, then he does fall another rung down the pecking order, which would be a shame. I do think he has something, but you know, sometimes it just doesn't work out. However, it's a long season. A lot of stuff can happen in the Championship, and you never know. There might be a call for him at some point through injuries, a suspension, and you never know. It only takes one chance to really go and get it. So hopefully that can happen for him at some point this season.
And we might as well talk about that hunt for an experienced striker. Obviously, Alexandre Mendy still the name that is being linked consistently. I mean, has there been any notable progress on that, do you think, Phil? Or is Sunderland any closer to getting their man through the door?
I mean, I think the fact that he's still not involved in any way with his team, was left out of the squad over the weekend, still training on his own. The player could not have been any clearer that Sunderland is still the move that he wants. I think we can say with a fair degree of certainty that's probably still the deal that Sunderland would like to do and are working on. An interesting reports from France that Ken are looking at Mbaye Niang, obviously formerly of AC Milan, who's a free agent. Now, obviously, that could have an impact if he signs, and it might make it more palatable for them to sell Mendy. It certainly suggests they're planning for a future without him. It's still one that I think there's a good chance that can happen, because ultimately it will be in his club's interest to sell him if he doesn't want to be there. Sunderland still want to sign him and he still wants to move. So if you were to ask me, do I think it will happen? I'd say yes, I think it probably will do at some point before the end of the window. There seems to be a bit of brinkmanship going on, which makes me nervous, to be honest. I never like it when it's like, we'll wait, we'll happily let it run till the end of the window. But I do think that's one that's got a strong chance of happening at some point, but you just never know, because there clearly is a fairly significant difference in valuation at the moment. But, I think that, Lebris last week was fairly bullish about something happening. He did say that we're not close to anything. There's nothing about to happen, but I'm pretty confident we'll see something happening. He did kind of hint there might be some movement this week. So I do think that might be one to watch over the next few days, because, he's normally very, very guarded, but he did kind of suggest that he felt that something was coming to the boil maybe a little bit. So let's wait and see on that one. But I think all the noises suggest that that's still the one that everyone's looking at. So fingers crossed. But yes, I am starting to get a little bit like, okay, lads, let's do this now. There's only a couple of weeks to go. But yeah, my gut still tells me that one's got a good chance. But let's see. I do think that while nobody's saying that the need for an experienced striker is just as much as it was on Saturday, Mayenda's goals don't change that. But I think it's a massive moment in the wider picture in terms of having a group of strikers, having someone who you can trust and who's full of confidence. I do think that's such a massive boost. As much for the squad depth as much as anything else.
I think that's the wider point with Sunderland, isn't it? Is that the anger last season was in part down to poor performances, but also in part down to the fact that it was perhaps a little bit avoidable, because we all know that Sunderland have some fine players, some really talented players, and they've shown that over these two games. They just needed a little bit of help, and there's perhaps a little bit of frustration that Sunderland haven't been able to push on in the transfer market when they had a mad Roberts and Clarke lighting it up. I know they did try with the Joe Geldhart loan. Then you had last season in the Championship again in January, they couldn't get Kiefer Moore over the line, and the squad depth does lack a little bit in places. I think that's, from the conversations I have with Sunderland fans, that's the most frustrating thing, is that there's clearly a really good 11. There's probably even 5 or 6 behind the 11 that could come in on an individual basis into a first team sort of lineup and do well, but it's a little bit of strength and depth at fullback, a little bit of strength and depth up front, because you do need a squad to get promoted out of the Championship, which is the stated aim of the manager and the board. So yeah, it's interesting times. I think that the last, 11 days or something of the transfer window will be fascinating, because it would be lovely if that experienced striker could come in the next couple of days, and then you can really assess what's going to happen with outgoings. We know it's not that simple, and obviously there's a huge question mark over Jack Clarke. You don't want that to go late in the window, so there's a lot at stake, isn't there? Because we could see we could see quite a bit of interest in some of Sunderland's players given their start of the season.
I mean, you mentioned Jack Clarke there. We might as well talk about him, because obviously another really eye-catching display against Wednesday. Didn't score, but he got an assist for himself and just looked like an absolute nightmare down that left-hand flank, like he does on a weekly basis, like we're so used to seeing at this point. Flurry of reports around his future over the weekend. Leeds United being linked with a potential homecoming. Talk about, contract negotiations with Sunderland, maybe not quite lining up, the club wanting one thing and the player maybe wanting a little bit more. I mean, where do you think we stand with the Jack Clarke situation right now, Phil?
I'm not convinced anything's actually changed, really, to be honest, in terms of Sunderland would love to sign Jack Clarke to a new contract, but there hasn't been a lot of talks really so far this year, just because I don't think anybody's really seen the value in it, because there was such a big gap. Are Sunderland now looking to have another go because there's some positivity, because they think it's worth trying potentially? Do I see that gap being bridged? I think it's unlikely, but of course you never know. In terms of the summer transfer stuff, the thing that, and James will be able to speak to this as well, the thing that's been said all summer really behind the scenes when you speak to people in football is that Sunderland rightly have put a huge valuation on Clarke, because he's still got 2 years left on his contract and he's absolutely central to the team. that valuation is so far put off Premier League clubs. I think that's fair to say. There's teams who like Clarke but aren't willing to go to that level of probably somewhere around 25 million. The situation has always been, is one of those clubs going to, panic's not quite the right word, but as they get to the end of the window, is someone going to decide, you know what, we actually need to go and push the button? That's always really been the case this summer, and it's still the case. The only thing that's kind of changed, I guess, is the Leeds thing. So, you know, Leeds would not have been in the race for Jack Clarke at the start of the summer. They sold Archie Gray for a lot of money, but they did that because they needed that sale for the profit and sustainability rules. What then happened is they brought in 20 odd million for Somerville. And then I think quite unexpectedly, they're bringing in 40 million for Ruta from Brighton. So now suddenly they do actually have a fairly significant amount of money that they can invest. Would they be willing to spend such a huge sum on Clarke? I'm not so sure. Sunderland would be very reluctant to sell to a divisional rival, so it would have to be a big bid. And certainly the noises from the Leeds end are that while they're obviously looking at Clarke because he's such an obvious replacement for Somerville, because they're so similar and his championship record's so good, I think at the moment they feel they're down the pecking order because there are Premier League clubs interested. So I know it's a bit of a non-update really, but I genuinely don't think anything's changed. There are a lot of clubs that like Clarke, and we're all still waiting to see if they're willing to go to the high valuation that Sunderland have put on him. If they do that, then there's a very good chance it'll happen. But as of yet, we just haven't had the indication that there is a team who's willing to do it. Because Sunderland quite rightly have made clear that there's a chance he goes, but it's going to cost an awful lot of money. And that's unchanged, really.
I suppose the question that a lot of fans are asking as well, James, you know, it does feel as if Jack Clarke is a Premier League quality player. I think we're all in agreement there. And if a Premier League club were to come in, spend that money, take him up with them, then, you know, that's kind of one thing. But for him to move to another championship club, I mean, only the player himself will know, I guess, but that doesn't quite seem as enticing, does it?
No, I'll stick my neck out on the line a little bit here, but I just don't see that Leeds move happening. I may be proved wrong, and this might get clipped up and I might look like an idiot, but I just, because of the Premier League interest on the table, the player will be aware of sort of Premier League money. Would Leeds pay more than perhaps Sunderland are offering? Possibly. Would it be as much as a Premier League club could offer? Probably not. Although they do have some cash in the bank. Does he want to go back to Leeds? I honestly don't know. I think for me, if Jack Clarke's moving, it's to step up. I'm not convinced he's going somewhere else in the Championship, but we could be wrong. As Phil mentioned, Sunderland would be, you know, uneasy selling to a divisional rival, potentially one that would like to compete with it as well over the season. I think, you know, for all the striker situation and the Alexandra Mendy situation is a little bit frustrating in a sense that clearly there's a gap in valuation, and Sunderland perhaps aren't willing to go all the way to Khan's valuation, and was there possibly the same with Kiefer Moore in January. But on the flip side of that, when it's a player that you don't want to sell and Sunderland are playing hardball, it's quite admirable in a way, really, that they've got that valuation. There's a sell-on fee due to Tottenham as well. They know how much that player is worth to Sunderland. He's hugely important, and they're prepared to play hardball over it. And I think that's sort of the flip side to this policy at Sunderland that actually does work quite well. But as we've mentioned several times on the podcast, you just don't want to get to a situation where he leaves right at the end of the window with, you know, an hour or a day or 15 minutes, whatever it is. That situation just leaves Sunderland with very little time to get anything done. And to replace a player of Clarke's quality is going to be very difficult. You'd probably have to sort of recreate him in the aggregate, if that makes sense. And are you going to be able to do that amount of business in that short space of time? Or are you going to do that before and prepare for Clarke going? And then even if Clarke doesn't go, still have those players there sitting around for 6 months. It's very, very difficult. Now, I don't envy it, but I think at the moment, you just have to praise his professionalism as well, because there's been a lot of talk about him for a long time, and he continues to deliver, continues to perform, clearly has a good relationship with the Sunderland fans. And I think we've seen with Chris Rigg, although Clarke doesn't appear to be anywhere near signing a new contract, is that actually Sunderland fans make a big, big difference to players' thoughts. And I think Sunderland fans' opinions really matter. And Clarke clearly loves it here. The love's reciprocated, I think. So I think he's probably quite relaxed about it, to be honest. I don't think he's banging down the door demanding a move. He's clearly playing well and has done for a long time. And Sunderland's a great stage to do it on. I do just wonder, though, although Sunderland are playing hardball and rightly so, whether now is the sweet spot to sell him if you want to get as much money as possible, because obviously if it drags into January or the next season, his valuation is going to go down a little bit just because of the time ticking on his contract. So I do wonder if he was to go and you knew you were going to lose him at some point in the next 18 months or so, whether now would be the best time to do it. But whether that leaves Sunderland enough time to get replacements in, whether they think that's worth it is a different matter. So it's hugely complex and complicated. But I think that should be reiterated just how good he's been under this cloud for quite some time. It's really impressive stuff and a testament to his professionalism.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, we spoke a lot about the striker situation. You know, the time recording there's 11 days left in the transfer window. I mean, are there any other areas of the squad, Phil, that, I mean, first of all, you believe Sunderland need to strengthen, and I guess secondly, that you anticipate them strengthening over the coming week and a half?
Yeah, I think it does depend massively on outgoings, to be honest. I think that, you know, the Clarke one's the obvious one, whereby at the moment, I think you'd be pretty happy with the options in the wide areas. But if Clarke goes, as James said, you're not going to replace him directly, but I think you would probably need to think about strengthening those positions, I think. Although I think it's pretty obvious now that we're seeing a real push to get minutes from Mundle. I think they obviously now see him as a big part of, not the entire solution if Clarke goes, but a big part of it. For me, I do think that fullback, I would like to see some cover come in there, because I think at the moment with Pembele clearly not in the thoughts, you know, I do think that that's a position that I would like to see some cover, because an injury or a suspension to Trachea would significantly upset the balance of the side, I think. We asked Labrice about that at his press conference last Friday, and he said, well, you know, we've got options. We could easily play with a back three and someone could fill in at wing back. Well, you wouldn't want that as a long-term solution, would you? So I just wonder if that's something that'll be sort of on their radar. Beyond that, I think it's massively dependent on outgoings. I think if Ballard's fit soon, then I think centre-half looks okay, given how well Elise is playing. Centre midfield, as we talked about, if Ekwar stays, looks pretty strong. But there's a few different factors, isn't there? You know, there's the Clarke outgoings. There were some noises about Auchiche, weren't there? You know, if Auchiche was to go, which I'm not saying will happen, there's been nothing concrete yet, but you know, that's an area where suddenly you're a little bit light behind Job. So I think, to be honest, the core of the squad's in place, is my view on it, without obviously the experienced striker, which is the big red flashing light priority. I definitely see fullback is an area that needs addressing before the end of the window, in my opinion. Beyond that, I think it's largely dependent on outgoings, really.
James, would you echo that?
Yeah, definitely. You know, obviously fullbacks are a concern. We mentioned Cirkin earlier. His injury record has been poor. Unfortunately, you could throw Elise into that category as well, although he's fit and firing now. He's had issues, so perhaps a little bit of cover there. It's such a shame, you know, because Niall Huggins is such a brilliant option and showed as such last season, but he's going to be out, Phil, what was it, until the new year, isn't it? Was it Mick Beale said until the new year? So he's not even an
January,
option on the table. Yeah. And then it'll take him a while, won't it?
Scenario, I think.
Yeah, and then it'll take him a while to get back up to speed. So that's a real shame. So a little bit of cover there. And I think Sunderland's squad generally looks fairly decent. It just needs a few other quality options and as I say, maybe a sort of understudy specialist left back. There's a couple of outgoings. You'd think Joe Anderson probably on his way at some point, perhaps a loan for Zach Johnson, maybe, although he was on the bench. So, as we've mentioned on the podcast previously, part of what Sunderland do in terms of incomings may depend on whether they do find loans or permanent solutions for these fringe players as well.
Lovely stuff. I think that's probably just about all we've got time for. The Raw will be back next Monday after that huge test against Burnley. I mean, it remains to be seen how Sunderland get through that one. But before that, keep up to date with all the latest Sunderland news on the Echo. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for James and Phil for joining me. And we will see you all next week.